Hey man,
Yo, what's up?
we don't have an idea for a video intro this week.
So let's brainstorm for a second and see if we can figure anything out. I've got it. We could use this as a funny intro about not having an intro.
That just sounds like we're being lazy and mildly humorous. I like it.
Hey, what's going on YouTube? I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite things to do, which is read. So last week I talked about how I started listening to a lot of audiobooks and about how a lot of times nowadays I can't find a lot of time to sit down and read an actual book. But if I am able to find that time and sit down and read a physical book, that's what I prefer to do. Reading has been a really big part of my life ever since probably around third grade, I can remember. And I really started to love fantasy and fiction and being able to dive into these worlds and have an escape from the world. I still remember to this day, back in fourth grade, we had this system called AR points, and you would read a book and you'd take a test and you would get a certain number of points if you passed the test, and you would get prizes at the end of the year. There was this robot that I was trying to win as a prize, and it was 300 AR points, which was like a huge deal. That's a lot of points, but I remember that year that I dove into books and was trying really hard to win this robot. And that's the year that I really started to enjoy reading. And even after that year, and even unto today, I still love to sit down and read a physical book. So I know a lot of people get out of high school or get out of college and they hear the word book and they cringe and they never want to read a book again. They read too many when they were in school. But for me, it's still almost like watching Netflix or watching a movie. It's almost that much fun when I can sit down in my chair for an hour and just go through a couple chapters of the book I'm reading. And if you are one of those people who has put off reading and doesn't read anymore after you got out of school, then I really recommend you go find a good book. It doesn't have to be fiction. It could be nonfiction. It could be about your career. It could be about something you're interested in. But there's just something about sitting down with a physical book that kind of puts your brain back into this gear of learning. So with that being said, I'm going to share with you guys a couple of the books that kind of make up the history of my reading way back to the beginning of when I started falling in love with reading up until now, some of the books I'm reading currently. So the first book I want to talk about is a series of unfortunate events. This one specifically is The Bad Beginning, which is the first book in the series of unfortunate events. This is a 13-book series written by Lemony Snicket, who is actually, his name is Daniel Handler. He goes by an alias when he wrote these books. So this was the first series of books that I really fell in love with, and this is what I really attribute to getting me into reading in the first place. So at the beginning of all of these books and interspersed throughout, the author, Lemony Snicket, basically says, don't read this book, put this book down, you're not going to like this book. And I think that really intrigued me back when I was in third or fourth grade reading these books. The author was telling me to put the book down. I wasn't feeling the pressure to read the book, get the points, fulfill the expectations of the author, fulfill the expectations of your teachers. It was kind of like refreshing that the author was telling me, you don't have to read this book. You're making the decision to do this. And so it made me feel like I was the one in charge. I was the one making the decision to actually do the reading. And this was also really the first series of books I read, and that really drew me in, where when I finished a book, I could go pick up the second book and then the third book and read this series instead of just reading one and done. So the next book I wanted to share was A Wrinkle in Time, which I might have actually read before I read a series of unfortunate events, but I remember this book being something I read in elementary school, and it really kind of turned my brain on to, literature as an art. When I was reading this book, it kind of felt like I was looking at a painting. I don't know if that makes much sense, but it was the first book I really remember reading that I viewed as a piece of art rather than a book, if that makes sense. So the next two books I'm going to mention I read because they were assigned to me as a project in either high school or college. And so these are books that I probably never would have picked up off the shelf and gave a go unless they were assigned to me. It was kind of forced. And the first one of those is Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I remember this being the first bit of critically acclaimed literature that I really fell in love with. A lot of books that were assigned in high school, like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Great Gatsby, never really drew me in. They were those books that I read for assignments and never really fell in love with. But after reading Catcher in the Rye, I started to actually view all of those type of American literature, all of those canon books a lot different. And I think it's because of the voice in this book, of the way this book was written. If you don't know, it is written mostly in passive voice, which gave it a really eclectic, a really new kind of vibe, and I really liked that about it. So I really attribute Catcher in the Rye to making me fall in love with literature and the history of what literature was in America, and then started to get me into even European literature. So because of this love of literature that Catcher in the Rye gave to me, when I got to college and I was assigned a literary project, I went and picked up Old Man and the Sea, which is by Ernest Hemingway. I've always been drawn to Hemingway, not necessarily because I've read a lot of his writing and love his writing, but more because of how prolific he was as a writer, how hardworking and how much he wrote and how he wrote. And a lot of the reason I read that book in the first place and chose to do my project on Hemingway was one quote that he has: "There is nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." Basically, the way Hemingway wrote was he sat down and he bled out his feelings, his emotions, and he really created this visceral art. His characters feel so real and feel so much like people you would actually meet in your real life, and that's what I really love about Hemingway, and that's why I chose to read Old Man and the Sea. And for the book itself, it's a really cool little story. It's a very thin little book, so if you want to pick up some Hemingway and just get a gist of how his writing is, then I'd suggest reading Old Man and the Sea. So the next book I want to talk about is a little bit different. I read it in college, and not because it was assigned to me, but because it was suggested to me by a friend that I really respect, and the book is Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller. I'm pretty sure this book would be categorized as a Christian life book, but I wouldn't really categorize it as that myself. I would suggest this to anyone, religious or not, because I really learned a lot about life in general from this book. The insights Donald Miller gives in this book really reflect how I try to live my life today. Something that really drew me into this book, even before I opened it, even before I knew anything about it, was this quote on the back of the book. "I never liked jazz music because jazz music doesn't resolve, but sometimes you have to watch somebody love something before you can love it yourself. I used to not like God because God didn't resolve, but that was before any of this happened." So I have this also other weird love of jazz music, and the love of the jazz music comes from kind of what Donald Miller was talking about how jazz doesn't resolve. A piece of jazz could go on forever, and it would have the same passion, it would have the same heart, it would have the same soul. There's no resolution to it. And I think that's really cool in music and in art, when something is so great that it could keep going and never end and still be awesome. But jazz music isn't really the point of this book. The point of this book really is, if you have any areas of your life where you're kind of lost and you're kind of struggling, Donald Miller probably hits on it in this book, and through anecdotes and through describing how he lived his life and how he figured certain things out in his life, you're probably going to gain something in your own life. Another book that I wanted to talk about, I actually don't have a copy of with me right now because I'm letting my girlfriend borrow it and read it. It's called The Power of Habit. This is written by Charles Duhigg, the same person who wrote Smarter, Faster, Better, which I mentioned in my last video. This is a book that kind of explains how humans form habits and really goes kind of more in depth about how we can change our habits, about how we can create new habits, and about how we can get rid of old habits. It really goes into a lot of insight about how humans are habitual creatures, and a lot of the things we do on a daily basis are because of habits we formed. And once you realize that, and once you make that connection in your brain, you can start to live your life in a different way, and knowing that you can manipulate your habits in order to do the things you want to do and accomplish the things you want to accomplish. And this is a book that I would suggest to literally everyone. It was kind of life-changing to realize psychologically that a lot of the things that I do in life aren't done cognitively, they're kind of done subconsciously. And once you realize this and make that connection, then you can really start having a lot more control over how you live your life. The last two books I'm going to mention are by my current favorite author, and the author is Brandon Sanderson. Really, a big reason that I started liking him as an author was there was a point in my life 3 years ago maybe that I wanted to be a creative writer, and I wanted to write novels, specifically fantasy novels. And I was doing some internet research about how to write whatever, just some teaching on it. And I found some YouTube videos of Brandon Sanderson, this dude I'd never heard of, and they were his lectures from his creative writing class. So I ended up watching most of Brandon Sanderson's creative writing lectures, probably 5 to 10 of them, and they were like legit college lectures. He would film them and put them on the internet, and that really made me fall in love with kind of him as a person and as a teacher. So then I figured I might as well go out and read some of his books. The first book of his I picked up is called Elantris. And if you want to start reading Brandon Sanderson, this is what I suggest that you start with. This is a standalone novel, so it's not in a series like some of his other works, and so you can just sit down and read this one novel and get a full and complete story. This is also a good place to start if you want to get into fantasy. Like if you've not read a lot of it, this is a good singleton novel that you can get started with. It has some really strong characters, a really strong female character, and it's really character driven. This is a fantasy book, and it takes place in a world where things happen that could happen in our world, but it goes deep and dives deep into certain questions that we may have about real life. It asks questions about identity, it asks questions about religion, it asks questions about really deep things that you wouldn't necessarily think of being in a fantasy novel. So the second book that I read by Brandon Sanderson was The Way of Kings, and this is book 1 of a series he is currently writing called the Stormlight Archive. This one was kind of daunting to me when I picked it up because it is like over 1,000 pages, and I now own the second and third books in this series, and they're the same size. So like these are big, thick books, and there's a lot of content and a lot of story in here, and that was really daunting to me at first because I felt like it was a lot of dedication. But when you think about how much dedication we put into like watching a Netflix show and getting sucked into binging a show, if you put that much dedication into reading a book and you fall in love with it as much as I fell in love with this book, then you're going to get the same amount of enjoyment out of it. This book really excites me too because it's the start of an epic series, and as I said before in this video, I'm really into series, not just reading one book and not being able to read anything else about those characters, but being able to read a whole series of books. So once I got into it, the fact that it's longer and the fact that it's going to be a really long series really appealed to me because I can stick with these characters and I can stick with this story for a really long time. So these were just a few of the books that I have read over the course of my schooling and my life, and I could go on and talk for days about the books that I've read and about the books that are sitting on my shelf back there. I've got books upon books that I haven't even started reading, and I really am just passionate about reading fantasy, reading nonfiction, and really passionate about learning what I can from those books. One of my main goals in life is to always be learning, to be learning something new every day, and by reading even fantasy books, you can learn a lot about yourself, you can learn a lot about the world around you. Fantasy books really are something that give you perspective into other cultures. Even though you're reading about fake cultures, it really gives you a lot of perspective. So if you're not into reading and you haven't picked up a book since high school or since college, I really recommend that you go either pick up one of these books that I suggested today, or to do some research on some popular books and find one that you like. I think you'll find it really fulfilling to sit down in a chair and maybe grab a cup of coffee and just read a book. I know a lot of times today we sit behind our computer screens or we are scrolling through Twitter or Instagram on our phone, and it's not really real, it's not really tangible, it's more of this digital fake thing we're living in. But when you disconnect for 30 minutes to an hour and sit down and read a physical book, it brings you a lot of relief from these social expectations that we find on the internet. And if you like this video, make sure to go down and hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified when I put out new videos. If you have any favorite books that you've read that you would like to suggest to others, go down in the comment section below and list a couple of your favorites and we can have a discussion about that. You can also follow me on my other social platforms at Clayton Hemrick, both Instagram and Twitter, or go to my website claytonhemrick.com to read my latest blog post. And with that being said, go read a book and I'll see you next Wednesday. today I wanted to talk